I want to speak generally about terrorism. I want to speak about the way it's constructed. I want to speak about the way it operationalizes, less so about what's happening in Syria, or less so what's happening in Gaza. We can talk about that. I'm knowledgeable about that. Other people in this room are even likely more knowledgeable than that than I. So we can talk about specifics. I'm more than happy to. But I want to, in a sense, speak in broad strokes. Okay? So first, I think it's somewhat important to maybe contextualize who I am and why this is somewhat relevant. Okay? So one is that I have a history of both writing about this and operating in movements that are affected by this discourse. So in a sense, I've been asked a lot, what kind of brought you to this and how do you get into a field like this? And in a sense, I'm an academic child of 9/11. I was in high school, it was my senior year of high school when 9/11 happened. I'm 33. So when I was deciding what to do with my life in an academic sense, where to go to college and these things, was during a time when people were speaking about political violence generally. Now that wasn't the first time I'd considered it. When 9/11 happened, I was part of the 0.5% of Americans who knew what Al-Qaeda was, who maybe knew where Afghanistan was, who were familiar with the linkage between the bombing of the USS Cole and the attacks in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam against the US embassies and Riyadh Towers and all these different things which are related to the same network. So when 9/11 happened, I was part of a somewhat small minority of people who wasn't especially shocked. I recently looked back at a journal I'd written that week, and that's kind of what I was speaking of, is a bit of a dismay that people were so shocked. The why did this happen, how could this happen to us discourse was really baffling to me. And what was more baffling to me at the time was people who said, why do they hate us, this trope? Why do they hate us with this kind of, arms up foolishness? And what I said is, that I don't quite understand the question, because if you're looking for a list of grievances, they have a list of grievances. If we're associating Al-Qaeda as being solely responsible for this as an organization, then certainly Osama bin Laden, in years prior, wrote statements that says, this is my problems with American foreign policy. I don't like US bases in Saudi Arabia. I don't like the US embargo and war against Iraq. I don't like US support for the Israeli regime and its oppression of Palestinians. It's somewhat more complex, but basically it was those 3 points. And so when people said, why do they hate us? And I said, as a, whatever, in high school, 17, 18-year-old, I was like, well, I know why, quote, they hate us. They had this list. And actually they had a list 2 years later. So there's been several, lists of why they hate us. And so when I encouraged people, my colleagues and friends, if you want to understand, quote, again, why they hate us, why don't we read what they wrote to us? Let's read these documents, let's read these statements. And I was met with a lot of resistance. A lot of people said that's crazy, I'm sure that's illegal, that's probably illegal, or things like that. And yeah, I found it somewhat ludicrous. I mean, there were print publications which had these things in them. They're certainly more common now. But I think that's important to understand, that put me on this path a bit, because when I said, well, the way that you determine, again, I keep putting it in air quotes, it's annoying, but I think it's important, why do they hate us? There is an answer, and the answer is to be found in the discourse put forth by the non-state actor, put forth by this entity, and any entity, right? It's not specific to Al-Qaeda in any sense. So that's one thing, and that got me interested. I went to school, I started studying non-state actors, I did a degree in international studies, but focused on social movements. I focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I had an extreme interest in how Palestinian armed groups operated, specifically the role women played in armed movements. I did this research in the States, I went to the Middle East, I did this research for a long period of time until my tenure there was cut short by a deportation and some other things. So I wasn't able to go back, I somewhat changed the trajectory of my research. And when I say research, I mean research as like a bachelor's degree, not research, not writing papers research, but my own personal research. The second thing is that during this time, 4 or 5 years later, we can date it as, say, 2004, 2005. I'm in college. I've been spending a few years organizing street demonstrations. I'm living in Washington, D.C. Between 2002 and 2006, we organized hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, to demonstrate against the IMF, the World Bank, and the war, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And during that time, I was affected by the terrorism discourse in a completely different and, in a sense, more personal way, in that friends and very close associates were arrested, Americans, and were called terrorists in the mainstream media. They were called terrorists by the United States government. They were called terrorists by the FBI and the Department of Justice. These are people I know, people I care for. And they were called terrorists for, in a sense, the point I want to lead to, which is the strategies and tactics they pursued and the politics they put forth. And I'm speaking, if this is too vague for people, I'm speaking mostly of leftists. I'm speaking of the people I'm calling my friends. I'm speaking of leftists. I'm speaking of people who are affiliated with what or the media would call, or what I guess we could somewhat fairly call, the radical environmental movement and the radical animal liberation movement. So these are people who are carrying out illegal acts of political violence, sabotage, vandalism. That's about 90% of it. There's 5 to, I know this because I did quantitative research on 70 years of this, or I'm sorry, 60 years of this. And about 5% of this milieu is using things like arson. Now these arsons, again, without going into a huge tangent, have never killed or injured a single person. These are arsons of property done by names like the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front. And I'm not here to defend and go into a large discourse about why I think this is a valid method of political protest and why I think this criminalization is unfair. The point I want to make is when people around me who used maybe slightly more militant tactics or maybe slightly more militant protest were being called terrorists in the media, that was alarming to me. The day after 9/11, on 9/12, I believe it was Rick Santorum, who's not generally a person I look to for advice, but he's a very conservative Pennsylvania-based senator, which is where I'm from. He made a comment about I forget the exact word, it was the radical environmental movement, I think was the term he probably used, or eco-terrorists, which is the shorthand. And he said, the things that we're seeing from these eco-terrorists are no worse than the things that we saw yesterday in Washington and New York. And I think that's highly problematic. Starting in about 2002 and going to about 2006, the FBI and the Department of Justice consistently, in their reports and public rhetoric, noted that radical environmental and animal rights activists constituted, I will put this in direct quotes, the #1 domestic terrorist threat. Now that to me is fundamentally problematic. And this is repeated, and I've written about this, you can look, I can tell you where I've written this, where I've traced through this rhetoric, and I've looked at every single document this is used in, and it's used repeatedly, time and time again, this phrasing, up until today. Now, the government cannot obviously make that point in any convincing manner now. Okay, so they've changed it. It's no longer a ranked system. They're now no longer the most domestic or the most extreme or whatever, but they're still listed as the kind of 5 parts when we talk about domestic terrorism of jihadist groups, white supremacists, anti-abortion groups, what we call anarchist extremists, which is a whole separate set of bullshit, and radical and animal or earth rights folks. So again, they're still included. I mean, to this day, the FBI has a newly designed child-friendly website about countering violent extremism, CVE. You can look at that site. It has a bizarre name which is escaping me right now. But it cites these 5 groups, and they're still listed as one of these groups. So the point I'm making is, in a sense, I'm being affected by 2 things in my own development. One is that I'm confused why no one is actually looking at why a seemingly rising trend in a specific type of jihadist or Salafi or Islamist terrorism is occurring. No one's actually looking into this in any, in my understanding, meaningful way. And 2 is that what is constantly being referenced is the fact that people who are engaging in illegal, yet in my definition, non-violent forms of political protest are being touted as terrorists. Now again, I can go through that point in a much more convincing way, so if you think that's bombastic, just take a little bit of my credit and say that I'm right. To cite just a few examples, a lot of the people who were arrested in what was called Operation Backfire, this is the large FBI raid on an Earth Liberation Front cell called, quote, the Family. These people were charged with terrorism enhancements. These are additional charges added onto federal sentences, which are very rarely used. And you can look at the records, this is all very public. They were charged as terrorists legally. They were also, in 3 cases, housed in what are called communications management units, which are prisons. There's 2 of them in the United States, in Terre Haute, Indiana, and the other one is in, now also escaping me.
Denver?
Sorry?
Denver?
No. It doesn't matter. But there's 2 of them in the country, and when you look at the ranks, they're over 90% Muslim. The folks in there who are not Muslim there's some FARC arms dealers, there's some the Carlos the Jackals in there, and a number of other well-known people. There's airline hijackers in there. There's people involved in all sorts of very vile acts. But again, most of them are of this kind of jihadist milieu, right? They're the people associated with 9/11, Zacarias Moussaoui, and all these different people. And so when you have, just to put it bluntly, white American leftists who have committed arson in the most secure prisons in the country, which are designed to prevent the prisoner from communicating with the world. Thus, that's why they're called communications management units. That to me is also problematic. I'm not saying that burning down a horse slaughter ranch should be legal. I don't think the horse slaughter ranches are just or ethical, but I acknowledge that it's illegal to burn them down. So if you burn them down and you get caught, okay, you can go to prison. I'm not debating that legal fact. But I am debating the treating of these people as violent, dangerous terrorists, which we should all be afraid of. So this is what kind of gets me working in this direction, okay? And I think that, reflecting back on what comes out of this, I try to reduce all of the kind of presumptions I'm using, the presumptions on violence, to maybe four points. And this is, when I teach courses on political violence, this is how I explain it. So I think this is the most succinct way. I'm not very succinct generally. One, and so I think this is important to understand how I am viewing terrorism. One is that violence, loosely defined for right now, is always viewed positionally. Right? Violence is always going to be viewed through your ethnicity, through your nationality, through your age, through all these sorts of positional facts. We can call them subjectivities, we can call them lots of things. So that's one. I think it's really important to acknowledge. The second is that if we can say, these are simplified terms of course, but if we can say there's a creator of violence and a recipient of violence, that those two entities are always going to view violence divergently. Think of a protester and a riot cop. Think of a hostage and a hostage taker. Think of someone surviving domestic violence and a batterer. Right? They're always inherently going to view that violence divergently. So when we think about those who feel aggressed upon and those who feel that they are the aggressors, or those who in actuality are the aggressors, they're not going to see violence similar. I am not going to see violence the same way as the United States Department of Homeland Security. It's not likely, despite the fact that most people in this field are of that ilk. There's a few exceptions certainly. The third is kind of a pair. The third is how violence is understood when it's put forth by the state. Again, I'm presuming from my position that the state, again broadly defined as the government and all the military entities and everything associated, that the state is a manufacturer of violence. And I don't mean in an abstract way, I mean in a real way. The state enacts legal violence, war, public execution, the entire judicial system, the creation of laws, the jailing of people, right? This is forms of violence. These are forms of violence. But that state violence is inherently understood as legal, justified, moral, ethical, the product of cost-benefit analysis, the product of reasonable thought. And it's enshrined in this veneer that protects it from critique. Right? It's difficult to critique militarism or war on a fundamental level on the basis of violence. Many people in this room probably do, but we are certainly not speaking of the majority. And the kind of counterpoint to that, the fourth point, is that non-state violence, right, violence carried out by non-state or sub-state actors, is inherently viewed opposite. It's viewed as chaotic, it's viewed as illegal, it's viewed as, it's often pathologized into crazy lunacy, it's viewed as immoral, unethical. It's viewed as not the product of a measured cost-benefit analysis, but the product of some sort of mental deficiency or extremism that we just somehow can't explain. And that, to me, again, needs to be interrogated. So if those 4 points are kind of kept as a presumption, I think it's important then that we understand that terrorism is a strategy, right? It's not a tactic. It's a strategy used for, and again, I say this in a meaningful way, and I choose my words carefully, but it's a strategy for social change. Now, it's not this type of social change that many of us are in favor of. And it's not the method of social change that many of us would prescribe. But it is a method of social change. I would argue that every, or nearly every, if not every incident that we would call terrorism is someone trying to fundamentally change the social or political order. Whether that's a white supremacist who wants an all-white country, whether that's someone who puts a bomb in an abortion clinic because they think abortion is illegal or murderous. Right? They're trying to change the society to fundamental moral, ethical, political level. Okay? So terrorism is a strategy. It's a method of confrontational politics. And I would argue that all politics exist on a continuum from, I mean, it depends what your most nonviolent continuum is. Maybe some sort of nonviolent civil disobedience, maybe something far to the left of that. In the middle, you have political participation, voting, and electioneering, and that stuff. And then, maybe towards the other extreme, you have violence. But these are all forms of politics. And again, I could cite lots of people who say this, and we could talk about Max Weber and all these people, and it's worth it to look into these things, but I think that's a pretty solid kind of basis. So as a strategy, what defines terrorism? What makes it different than anything else? Well, one is that it's low cost, right? It's widely available. The logistical needs are low. You don't need a supply chain. You don't need you don't necessarily need an arms supplier. You don't need a this person or that person, right? It's something that's easily reproducible. In the language, a lexicon of anarchists, we would say DIY, right? The kind of do-it-yourself form of violence. It doesn't require an air force or a navy, though there are many non-state actors with air forces and navies. And it doesn't require a complex bureaucracy, right? It doesn't require a chain of command and a joint chief. So I can decide to, build a Molotov cocktail and throw it through the window of a Starbucks, right? It takes 5 minutes, costs $3, and we could do it, right? That's something people can do. And so as a strategy that's adoptable by anyone, terrorism is different than other forms of political violence, right? Individual people can't engage in every strategy of political violence, right? I can't, arguably, myself engage in the strategy of guerrilla warfare, right? It requires much more of a network and a bit more of a bureaucracy and a bit more people and this and that. But as a strategy, terrorism is, kind of anyone can do it, right? That's kind of the point. And the other thing that I think is important to understand is that terrorism is a strategic strategy. I know that's redundant, but in a sense, it's a strategy which, when viewed in certain manners, is successful. And again, I'm putting successful in quotes, but it does create things. It creates a response, which is sometimes the only point. If you look at the kind of general discourse on Al-Qaeda now that's coming out from most academics, as a strategy, Al-Qaeda successfully drew the U.S. specifically and the West broadly into a international war against the Muslim world. That was their goal. That was their strategy, and they have succeeded. So terrorism for Al-Qaeda worked. It brought the U.S. into a seemingly unending war against a Orientalist othered entity, i.e. Muslims and Asians and Arabs in most countries of the world. And you can look at the expansion of proxy wars by Obama in Africa and Asia as an example of that. And if you look at, if we were to talk about scholarship and the research on this, there's people far more mainstream and far more credentialed than me that make similar points. Just to cite one example, there's a University of Chicago professor who I think's work is really good, named Robert Pape, P-A-P-E, who's written a lot of things. He wrote a book which is most well known called Dying to Win. He also has an article which is basically a compression of the entire book into an article. I'd suggest that. And what he argues is that he looks at suicide bombing. He does a quantitative analysis of suicide bombing over a multi-decade period. And what he finds, which again was not a surprise to me, but I think is a very surprising finding for a lot of people, is that why do people engage in suicide bombing? Is it because they are seeking 72 virgins in paradise and martyrdom and they're crazy and they have no options for political expression? No, it's not. It's to drive out foreign occupations. It's the Tamil Tigers trying to drive out the Indians and some parts of the Sri Lankan government. Right? It's the Palestinians trying to drive out the Israelis. It's Lebanese Hezbollah trying to drive out the Israelis. It's Iraqi insurgency trying to drive out the U.S. Right? That when we look at, and there's older examples that are probably less well known. But we look at, for instance, suicide bombing, which is often seen as the most terroristic form of terrorism. It's actually a strategy that, on a level of a measurable level, is successful. And if we think that strategies are thus effective, if strategies are adopted because of success, I mean, why else would you adopt a strategy? Then it actually is somewhat reasonable. So I think if we're going to summarize what terrorism is, generally, I would say that terrorism is a defamatory label, right? It's a label that's applied to specific forms of violence, specifically non-state forms of violence, right? The notion of state terrorism is not a popular notion. Yes, I use it. Other people in this room probably use that term, but that's not a term that is widely accepted, right? When you say, the post 9/11 war and embargo in Iraq killed 1.5 million Iraqis, and that's a form of state terrorism, that's not a popular notion. Leaving depleted uranium, causing extreme cancer rates in Iraq, I would argue is a form of state terrorism. Yes. Bombing of, just to bring it back to my locale, the bombing of the MOVE compound in Philadelphia in 1980, on Mother's Day of 1985, that killed tens of people, children and adults. That killed them in their house by dropping C4 plastic explosives, a military-grade explosive, on a civilian home in a dense urban neighborhood in a city of many million people. That to me is a form of state terrorism, the use of military tactics for civil dissent. There's lots of things which I would argue are forms of state terrorism, but again, when the violence is done by the state, it's not terrorism. So I would argue that terrorism is a defamatory label applied to non-state forms of violence. But specific, and it's applied extremely asymmetrically, right? Extremely unevenly across the board, based on all sorts of political factors. And I would argue that it's most routinely applied to those who kind of meet broadly two conditions. One, to cite Weber again, to Max Weber, one is that terrorism is violence that challenges the state's monopoly on violence, right? The state wants to be the sole creator of violence, right? The state makes war. If I make war, right, in my neighborhood, that's not okay, right? The state is supposed to be the entity that maintains the monopoly on violence. And Weber would argue, and I would agree, that this is done to maintain legitimacy and order, right? If anyone can just, raise a militia and fight, that is somewhat destabilizing for governance. But there's a second condition, right? It's not just that the violence it's not just that you're violating the state's monopoly on violence, because many people do, but it's that the politics that are being offered are of a specific nature. They're anti-state, or they're anti-capitalist, or they're broadly anti-Western. I think to understand terrorism, one, I think we need to interrogate the word and the way we use it and the routineness in which we use it. Okay, fine. But we have to be conversant in the discourse of terrorism. And by that, I mean that we should be as familiar with the justifications and the reasons put forth by the FBI as we are the non-state actor themselves.